Feminerds out there. This is Beckah.
And this is Leigh.
And we are here with another episode of File 741 for you. We are thrilled to have local artist and comics creator Dylan Edwards here with us to talk about some of his works. So welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Yay. All right. First question is I loved your auto bio mini comics. What made you decide to turn these experiences in your life into comics?
The short and brutal answer is that people offered to pay me money to do it.
Fair.
So that's often like, what am I going to work on now? Who is giving me money now? But part of that came about because I was writing about topics that have not been as extensively covered in a lot of outlets. So I was writing about, nonfiction work about trans stuff and about queer identity and asexual identity and the intersections of trans and queer and asexual identity. And the people who are paying for this are kind of mainstream to semi-mainstream outlets like Fusion, which is now Splinter News, and the Nib and places like that. So these are fairly broad platforms that are, a little bit more reach than just like, I'm going to do a webcomic and put it on Tumblr, although some Tumblr comics obviously blow up, but it's like, but Tumblr doesn't pay you money to put stuff on.
Right.
So that was part of it was just wanting to talk about things that I hadn't seen discussed a whole lot, and part of it was people saying, here's some money to talk about these things that you don't see discussed a lot. So.
Oh, that's really great to be able to be offered that outlet.
It's a long chain of events from there. I've been doing comics for almost 20 years, and one connection leads to the next connection leads to the next connection. Like, I probably wouldn't have gotten the thing with the Nib if I hadn't done the thing with Splinter News, and I wouldn't have got that if I hadn't done, transposes, and I wouldn't have done transposes if I hadn't known Alison Bechdel, and if I hadn't done Politically Incorrect, I never would have met Alison Bechdel. So, it's this long thread of like each project kind of leads to the next project in a way that you can never plan for, and you have no idea what is going to end up being the thing that people, grab onto.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think that really helps emphasize this idea to, as cliche as it sounds, to never give up. Because again, you never really know what's the thing that is going to work out.
Right.
And so if you keep working and keep exploring,
right,
it will get there.
Yeah, and you may be thinking the very first comic you did is, this is it, this is my most amazing comic. But as you work on it, any artistic medium, the more you work on it, the more you learn it, the more you kind of grow as an artist, and then you look back on that thing that you thought was so great, and you're like, oh my God, what was I thinking? What was I doing?
Yeah.
I think that's fairly common, and occasionally you'll go back and look at your old stuff and be like, that was actually pretty good. Good job, me. But yeah, like sticking with it for longer than if you give up after the first year, you're not really going to see much of anything happen. You kind of have to plan to stick with it for at least a year. I find a lot of people burn out after that point. But if you really want to be serious about it, try to give yourself at least a year to work on stuff and see if you can build anything out of it.
That's great advice, especially for my own comic. So I have so many doubts about myself. Well, that does lead a little bit into my next question, which is, have you always liked comics and drawing them? And when did you start doing it professionally?
So I have always, my earliest comics that I remember reading were my parents' Peanuts collections. And those were some of the first books I can remember reading at all of any kind. And I read them over and over again, and I traced them and, copied little drawings of Snoopy everywhere. And when I was about 8 years old, I tried to create my own newspaper strip, which was about a talking horse and lifted many gags directly from Peanuts. But I was 8 years old and didn't understand copyright and plagiarism. So also didn't understand that the strips are not drawn at print size and they're not done in pencil usually. So I had a lot to learn about technique. But but certainly I was kind of experimenting with the medium from a very early age. And like one of the earliest comics I actually finished was when I was probably around maybe 11 or 12 years old. The first professional comic I did was published in a feminist newspaper called Sojourner, the Women's Truth, which is no longer in publication, but this would have been, I think, around 2000. And this was before I had come out to myself as trans, and I was exploring queer identities, and I was trying at that time to be a lesbian, and it was about the foibles of trying to be a lesbian. It was one of those things where actually my roommate at that time was working at Sojourner and was like, you should submit this and maybe they'll publish it. So I'm like, okay. And I submitted it and they published it. So that was the first time I had, been in print in an actual publication that gave me dollars in exchange for the comic.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
That is awesome.
So have you found the comic community to be more open and welcoming over the years towards queer and trans artists and stories? I think, like you said, it kind of one thing led to another, but how difficult was it to find those spaces? Did you have to create your own?
So there were kind of a couple of parts to that. I mostly exhibit at conventions.
Right.
And there are certainly some conventions that it's not worth my time to go to because they're not, like, some people there, I'm just not going to find the audience that I want there. They're looking for, where's your drawings of Spider-Man or whatever. So part of it has been figuring out which conventions are the most queer-friendly and welcoming and kind of hitting up those. And that's a lot of the more indie conventions and things like Denver Zine Fest and Dink are just very embracing, like, come show your stuff here. We want more queer stuff. The mainstream conventions have gotten more and more open and welcoming over the years, I have found. I've been doing conventions since, I think the first one was around 2003 or so. So 15-ish years. And certainly early on, I would have my queer comics out there, and people who, like, queer people would come up and be like, oh, queer comics. The queer adults would come up and be like, oh, queer comics. Straight cis people would look at it long enough to figure out it was queer and then do that thing where they're like, how quickly can I get away before this turns into gay? And you'd kind of roll your eyes, okay, whatever, y'all get out of my way. But that has changed over the years, I have found, for the most part. And it's not just that I have focused on conventions that are welcoming to queer spaces, but that I think the average convention attendee, who's maybe not even going there thinking I'm going to go find some queer comics, but is just more open to the concept of the material, I have definitely noticed a change in, like, it went from, okay, only queer adults are coming up to the table and buying stuff, then it was a straight person would be like, I'm straight, but I have a gay friend. But I'm straight, but I'm buying this for my gay friend. And that segued into, cis straight people being like, I'm actually interested in this material for myself, and either like, oh yeah, cool, queer stuff, awesome, or like, I'd like to know more about this, and I would like to read these things. The thing that's changed in the last few years that I actually find makes me feel very warm and fuzzy is the people who come up every show now. I get someone coming up to the table who is an adult who is like, I have in my life a queer or trans kid, and I want to buy a comic for them. What have you got that's age appropriate for, a 13-year-old or whatever? So now you've got people who are bringing their queer and trans kids over, and sometimes it's great. The kid is like, oh wow, and sometimes the kid's like, Mom, God, like, you're embarrassing me. But to watch the families as a whole become more welcoming of queer content and being excited for that and reaching out for that, that has definitely been a change that I've noticed that has been a very positive change as far as the people coming being very welcoming, and then that encourages the conventions to be like, oh, we need to make sure that we're having queer people tabling there so that we have stuff for these people to buy.
Great.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too. You know, Leigh and I are both she's in education and I work at a library, and so we see a lot of that. We see people coming in wanting material and having access to material that more closely represents them or their families. And so I think it's great that you have seen that trend and can see the benefits that are coming of that.
My favorite was a couple of years ago at San Diego. A family came up with their 8-year-old trans kid, and they bought one of everything and said, we have a shelf for him, and as he ages into each of these books, he gets access to a new level of the bookshelf. And I'm like, this is adorable.
That's really cool.
So basically they were like, we're not letting this stuff pass us by.
Yeah.
We are taking everything we can get our hands on so that their kid has access to several different levels of material as he gets to a point where he's age appropriate for whatever that material is.
Different life stages.
Yeah, exactly.
That's really cool. Well, I also really appreciate your art style. Do you primarily hand draw and color your comics, or do you create them digitally?
I work almost exclusively in physical media. My typical process for a comic is I do thumbnailing digitally so that I can get as much flexibility of moving panels around, moving dialogue around, making this character bigger or smaller or whatever, and then I print out the thumbnails and tape them to the drafting table, and then I physically draw in pencil on Bristol board and then ink that, scan the inks, paint, and I use paint and marker to color, and then scan that and then merge the black line inks with the color, and then I usually do lettering digitally. That's something I used to do hand lettering, and now I do digital lettering because my hands hurt a lot if I spend that much time, doing lettering. So I prioritize my hand for drawing rather than lettering. So it's almost exclusively physical media for the actual creation of the art. There are a couple of exceptions. In Valley of the Silk Sky, some of the characters see in the infrared spectrum, and I do the infrared stuff in digital color because I want it to look like a different type of light, because it is a different type of light, and so that it should contrast with the painted stuff so that it's like they're actually seeing something very different from what the people who are seeing in the visible light spectrum are seeing. So that's the only thing that I do digitally usually. The other exception is for anthologies that are requesting black and white artwork. I usually do the shading now digitally because I want to go back and color it later, but they want it in grayscale, so I go ahead and do digital shading for that for publication, and then when the project I'm working on right now is going back and recoloring one of those old comics and doing physical media for the color to replace the digital shading.
Is there a specific reason why you choose to do it that way? Did you try it all digitally and found it didn't work for you, or? I
find that digital feels a lot more like work to me than I find it harder to get into. It's kind of it's just another medium, but it's not my favorite medium. I probably wouldn't enjoy cutting out pieces of Zipatone either. That would be another way of shading a comic, but so I happen to enjoy marker and paint, and so that's kind of what I gravitate towards. I also don't have a great setup for doing digital. My tablet is probably about 15 years old, and it's one of those where you're having to look up at the screen while your hand is doing something here that you're watching, and so it's very difficult to coordinate something. And in order to switch over to a digital setup, I would have to spend an enormous amount of money on new equipment, and it's why? That's not something I feel motivated to do because I don't enjoy digital as much anyway. So I'm not what if I spent $2,000 to do this thing that I might not like?
Okay. So we did notice that your style did evolve from black and white to color. Did you decide to change it based on the topic of the comic?
It's actually based on what format it's going to be printed in.
Okay.
So back in the olden days, when I started doing comics in 2000, your options for publication were newspapers, like for indie people. Like alt newspapers, queer newspapers, like Sojourner, the Women's Forum, for example. Or you could self-publish your own comics. So either doing black and like mini comics photocopied on a copier. At that time, color printing was too expensive to do.
Right.
So prioritizing for black and white gave you the most options for where you could ultimately end up publishing it. So that's why I started out in black and white. And the very, very earliest stuff was all crosshatched, which I found to have the same problem that hand lettering does, which is that crosshatching is very, very hard on my hands and wrists. So I did shift. That was the impetus to shift from crosshatching to doing marker shading and ink wash, is because that was like, this is much more gentle on my poor little fingers. I started doing color because we can talk about it more later when we talk about the outfield more, but that was a comic that I was doing for a website called outsports.com, and I did like the first 5 or so in grayscale. And then I said, do you actually want grayscale or do you want color? And they're like, actually, we would prefer color. So because it was getting published online, we were not concerned about printing costs. So I was like, I'll do color work. And that kind of was the start of me working more in color. I still did politically incorrect in black and white and grayscale, because that I was focusing still on how, like, doing zines and print publications for that. So it was kind of doing different things at once, but that was it. It was more about where is this going to get published, how is it getting published, rather than any particular love for black and white or particular love for color. That's just kind of how
the practicality of it.
Yeah, basically.
So. I just find that endlessly fascinating. We love hearing about everybody's different techniques and how they come about and how they change, and
everybody's so different. We haven't had a single person who's had a similar way of doing things, so it's really cool how everybody has their own. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of politically incorrect, I enjoyed that a lot more than I thought I would due to my own experience, but I really appreciated how thought-provoking it was for me. There aren't a lot of queer comics with positive representation of Republicans as the main characters, and I appreciated how you gave them a voice and how you humanized and normalized their lives. We're all still part of the same community, even if I don't agree with their politics. That was a really brave thing to do, especially in the early 2000s. Did you receive any backlash at the time? And what made you decide to write this comic?
So I'm going to answer that second question first.
Okay.
What made me decide to write this comic was that I had a ridiculous idea for a comic that would be funny if it were, like, it was just this one strip. That was it. I had an idea for a single strip that was making fun of gay Republicans, because I was like, haha, how could a gay person possibly be a Republican? But I'll make jokes about, like, I'll play with the idea of the stereotype of a Republican as a gay person, and then that'll be hilarious. And I did that one comic, and people actually responded pretty well to that first comic. And then I did a couple more, as I had a couple more ideas, like, here are more ways I will make fun of people for being gay Republicans. And after about the third comic, a lot of writers have had this experience. After about the third comic, the characters basically both were like, actually, we don't give a shit what you're trying to do. We're going to go do this other thing over here, because we are now fully fledged human beings who are completely, like, running amok, way far away from anything you had decided to do in the first place. I completely lost control of them. Like, I was like, I guess I'll just start writing down what you guys are doing, because I don't even know what's happening here anymore. And I think that was when it shifted from just being this kind of straight up satire into much more of a character driven thing. People did start to have a little bit of like a, why are you writing about Republicans? And I'm like, I don't know.
It just happened.
It did kind of just happen. And I mean, I never approached it with the idea of being malicious or cruel. I just was kind of like poking fun at a thing. But when the characters became human on me, despite my best efforts, I just had to start accepting their wholeness, and that ended up kind of writing these other things about them.
I love that.
And
that's awesome.
So the backlash, I mean, I wouldn't say I got a huge backlash on that, but I have definitely had people who have kind of refused to read it because they are making an assumption about what it must be about, thinking it must be a political treatise trying to proselytize republicanism to queer people, which it is not. It's honestly, as it went on, became less and less about politics per se than about the characters interacting with each other. I did have a few gay Republicans start reading it and being like, we understand you're satirizing us, but we like this anyway. So it was kind of like, it was a little bit of a weird experience around that. And I would say, like, I started writing that, when I started writing that, I was living in Massachusetts. And I grew up in Texas. So I grew up with, the Republicans in Texas were very much religious conservatives. Like, that's kind of my family, is this particular type of Republican conservative that is very much based around Christianity for the most part. That was all like, being gay is wrong and a sin and you will burn in hell forever kind of a thing. And I moved to Massachusetts, and I was working in a place that shaded conservative, but it was like, I have a job that is paying me money and I can now live and afford food and rent. And the interesting thing about working that particular job was it did put me in contact with kind of the Massachusetts version of Republicans, which is very different, or was very different at that time. And it was much more of an old school laissez-faire, like, I don't necessarily agree with how they, like, it was more of a policy discussion rather than, social engineering of, we are going to, try to eliminate all queer people or whatever. So it was more like, okay, we're going to have policy discussions about how taxes are going to be implemented and all that kind of thing. So one of the most interesting things to come out of that was living in Massachusetts and having a state level race where the Democrat was a conservative Catholic who was anti-abortion and anti-gay, and the Republican opponent was a gay man who was pro-choice and pro-gay rights. And it's like, it's like,
we're living in the upside down.
I know. It's like, this is like one of the only times in my entire life I have voted for a Republican, because like the gay Republican is the one who is actually socially more in line with my values than the Democrat.
Yeah.
Which was, it was an unusual experience from what I'd grown up. So that kind of put me in the mindset of like, I have been a little bit, in my stereotyping, I have been a little unfair, perhaps. And so I need to rethink how this is a more complicated issue than I had thought. Now, to be fair, in the intervening 20 years-ish, Republicans have gone in a very different direction.
Right.
So, I think that's part of why I kind of stopped writing politically incorrect, is because I found it harder and harder to write the characters in a way that was honest with them, that also didn't make me want to scream.
Right.
So it's like, I'm going to write about some different things now.
Sure.
But that's kind of how that all happened. So yes, it was very weird and unexpected, and I did not sit down and plan it. It just sort of fell on top of me. Because that's how creativity works sometimes.
Well, it was very enjoyable. And like Leigh said, it was a different sort of idea that we don't see very often. So we appreciated that perspective. Going back to the outfield a bit, that made me think about how, especially in baseball, which is my favorite sport, I don't usually watch sports, but how few Major League Baseball players there are. I think there's been like 2. So that was also really cool to see a queer-centered sports-related comic. So you said that was for a website?
Yeah, so that was another thing that started out. I also love baseball, and living in Boston, like living in the Northeast, you kind of are obligated to be into baseball to some extent. Like I would go to the grocery store and people are like, how are the Red Sox doing? And I'm like, oh, they were, top of the sixth, they were ahead by 3 runs. Like it's a weird community thing that is actually kind of gratifying if you've never had an experience of like, I enjoy a mainstream thing that other humans that I don't know also enjoy, and we will talk about it at the grocery store. So the outfield started because I had, again, one idea for one comic, where I was like, I have this funny idea for a comic about Barry Zito, and people talking about whether or not he's queer, and because there was some speculation at that time, like, in all of Major League Baseball, there are some queer people playing, they're just not out.
Right.
So people always like to speculate over who that could possibly be, and so I wrote a comic about that, a bunch of people, made up people voicing their speculation about Barry Zito. And I had been reading outsports.com because that was a website for people who were into sports and were queer identified, and so it was like, here we can talk about sports without having to worry about somebody dropping homophobia on us. Mm. So I approached them and said, hey, I made this comic. Would you like to publish this comic? And they're like, we would like to publish this comic. And we would also like you to do monthly feature for us. Queer sports comic. And I'm like, okay. So that was my second gig of like ongoing paid professional work in comics, was doing this monthly comic that, like, the stipulations they gave me were they wanted the comic to be about whatever sport was in season, so I couldn't only do baseball, which was too bad because I would have done the entire thing about baseball. Right. I could have. And I couldn't have an ongoing storyline because they didn't want to be like, month to month, what happened last
Right.
time? So they had to be standalone comics that, whatever. They had to center whatever sport was in season at that particular time. So that was how that came about, and I did that comic for, I think, 6 or 7 years of just cranking out a monthly comic about here. And it's one of those things where it's one thing to have an idea and to have it fully fleshed and ready to go, and another thing entirely to be like, you have a deadline, you better come up with something clever in the next 3 days to have this thing published, because otherwise you have to give back the money they paid you to do this.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that was another one that was like kind of an unusual way for, like, I did not plan to go, I'm going to go do a monthly sports comic.
Right.
Sort of, that one just kind of fell into my lap. So.
And that seems kind of fun to do something that's a little bit more lighthearted. Yeah. I mean, I don't also want to say, just by being queer you are political, but like that's kind of true. But being able to focus on something that's not so Republicans
Republicans having arguments with liberals over stuff and things. Yeah, just to be like, and because it was explicitly a humor comic, right? To be like, this is really more about, can I make somebody laugh with this thing, rather than let's talk about issues now.
Right. Mm-hmm. Oh yes, I'm still talking. I'm still asking questions here. So let's talk about the Valley of the Silk Sky, because it's very different from a lot of your other work. I read it all really quickly because I read the first few pages and was so into it. Oh, wow. And then I got to page, 95, and I was like, I need more of it. Right. So what brought you to a sci-fi genre? Right.
So that is actually, of all the things I've done, that's probably been kicking around the longest in one form or another. I have always been a giant nerd, and the books that I gravitated to as a kid and as a teenager were sci-fi fantasy. I read, Lord of the Rings when I was 11 years old, and read a lot of Asimov and whatever, like, kind of classic sci-fi fantasy type stuff. And one of the things that always stands out, like, when I think back on it now, is like how much of it was it's all still very cishet. Like, you can read in queerness into Lord of the Rings justifiably, but it's not a deliberate attempt to represent queerness and transness. And a lot of things are just like, everyone in space is straight, and and cis and whatever. And it's like, how weird that 200 years from now, everyone is straight and cis. And,
Right.
So the impetus for actually making a comic was like, I honestly have a long-standing love for genre fiction, but I want to make something that is like beating you over the head with all the queerness and transness of it, but that isn't about, homophobia in space. It's like, I don't want it to be an issues book. I want it to be queer and trans people being the protagonists and running around having adventures that don't particularly focus on their identity. Because I do the identity stuff in my autobio comics and in my nonfiction work, and this is more about like, what weird monsters can I make up? So a lot of that, I also was a nerd who has played a lot of D&D, and I DM'd a lot of games. Like, I did a lot of world building as part of just running adventures. And what was funny to me was to go back and think, I've had this brilliant original idea for my comic, and go back and look at some of my old D&D things, and it was like, oh, I had that idea when I was 15.
Right.
I just forgot that I had that idea when I was 15, but apparently that just lodged somewhere in my brain and is expressing itself in this way. So yeah.
Yeah, that's something that I latched onto right away. I felt like the world was so interesting, the way people dressed and spoke to each other. I really like playing open world RPGs, and so I was like, I want to play.
Right.
I want to be in this world and like play a character and
I think I would
wander around.
That is actually my fantasy more than like someone making like an either a role playing game or an RPG video game of this. I think it would be awesome.
Oh, that would be
It's
so
something I have no talent for myself.
amazing.
But there is, I'm a nerd for world building, and that kind of stuff lends itself very well to kind of open RPG style play.
Yeah, and this was, I also read quite a bit of science fiction, and this was the first comic or kind of sci-fi genre that used ze-their pronouns. I've seen some they-their pronouns.
Right.
And so there was such a variety of gender and sexual identities, but it wasn't categorized.
Right.
Like, everybody kind of had the same system. So do you find that it's easier to create those sort of characters when they're not necessarily based in a nonfiction, like in a
right.
realistic world?
I guess in that respect it's a little more freeing anyway, because one of the conceits of the world, or at least the culture that I'm exploring in these stories, is, what if not transphobic? What if not homophobic? What if that was just never part of their culture? And so the things that we talk about today as far as gender and sexuality are often about trying to tease apart the ways that we have been oppressed on those axes because of the culture we came up in. So when you remove that, the nature of the conversation changes about what does it mean to be trans in a world where you're not told that you were born with a penis, so you're a boy or whatever.
Right. Where you're not trans.
Right.
I'm doing air quotes.
Right. So, but at the same time, wanting to show a representation of transness because I still want people like trans readers to come to this and see themselves existing in this world. And the fact of the matter is, removing that societal pressure doesn't remove dysphoria. Like, that's a different thing. So you can still, you could have your gender validated but still experience physical dysphoria that you need some kind of relief from, or you can not have physical dysphoria but have gender dysphoria and all this kind of other, it's much more complex than just, a cis-binary system would have you think. And so part of it is what happens culturally, what happens medically when the problem is not convincing the doctor to let you take hormones. The problem is, how do you synthesize hormones in a world that has their particular level of technology?
Right.
And that becomes a more interesting problem for me to solve in a fantasy sci-fi realm of let's not make the problem you aren't allowed to be trans. Let's make the problem, how does medicine work?
That's
so that kind of it's more
really interesting.
So So whether or not that's easier, I don't know, because I have to reinvent a lot of things. But at the same time, I feel like you change the way the reader approaches the story when you're not apologizing or explaining your characters to them. It's sort of like, here they are, deal, rather than, this person is trans, but you have to love them anyway because, you just should feel bad if you don't. It's like, you can, whatever. I don't know. Like, I'm definitely writing for myself in that respect of, like, just wanting to see what happens to the world when that is... you mentioned the clothing, and, like, part of it is that how does clothing design change when a culture is accommodating of trans individuals who may be experiencing a type of dysphoria that they don't have a good workaround for? And if your culture is like, we're just going to make sure that you don't have to focus on that body part because of they don't have the same type of surgery that we have now. That is a thing they might work toward at some point, but at the snapshot of the moment they're in, that's not really an option. So it's like, how do you live with a body part that you're not comfortable with? Well, if society isn't beating you over the head about how you have to learn to accept that body part, but just like, hey, we can all just not focus on this. What does that change about how people feel, like how much dysphoria they experience?
Yeah. I think there's a lot of discourse nowadays about making sure there are more trans creators and contributors, because I think, a lot of historical representation of trans people is like, I have to show the transition. I have to show this painful journey in order to understand this person. And so I appreciate that you have both. You have your writings about the trans experience and about what it's like being trans, but also creating worlds in which it's just not, people aren't obsessed with it like they are in the real world.
Right. And part of that is a lot of stuff, like a lot of the kind of our currently available trans literature still has a lot of cis gaze going on. It's Gaze, not Gays, although there is that too. But what happens when you remove that even as a thing that you worry about? Like, what if you're not even concerned with, how do I explain this to cis people? What if you just don't care whether or not cis people understand? So this was something that Alison Bechdel did in Dykes to Watch Out For early on. Eventually she kind of moved away from this, but when she first started the comic, she refused to put any non-female characters in there because she wanted to force non-female people to have to identify with a female character. And she wasn't going to apologize for it, and she wasn't going to try to explain being a woman to cis men. It was just like, if you're going to read my comic, I'm not going to give you a dude to latch onto. You're going to read about women in this. So, and I think as she, part of what kind of I think grew her out of that was more conversations about diversity of gender and like, okay, well, what does that mean for including trans characters? Well, what does that mean for including bisexual characters, and so on and so forth. But that was an interesting concept to found at least as a foundational principle of, how do I not apologize for my own existence to people that honestly are not, like, I don't need to spend a whole lot of time explaining myself to them. Like,
Yeah. It's like watching a show where it's like 90% aliens, but you have to have one human, otherwise I'm not going to be able to relate at all.
Right.
And so just kind of going along with that, is it Daraz? Is that how you pronounce?
I say it Daraz. I also have not really come up with a hard line. This is how it's pronounced. So I don't care too much.
Yeah. Well, it's all beautiful. And so detailed and intricate. And of course, you said you're a huge sci-fi nerd. And so do you see specific inspirations in those character designs?
Yeah, so I'll back up a little bit. So the reason I call Valley of the Silk Sky sci-fi instead of fantasy is because everything in there that's weird is somehow based in real Earth science. So it has a fantasy feel to it because of the level of technology they have, which is more analogous to like 1850s Europe, as far as like what kinds of access they have to what medical procedures they have and blah blah blah. But as far as like the Daras are, I basically put bees and monotremes and rhinoceroses and primates into a blender and wombats, and it was like, what happens if we mix all this together? So it's a fantastical look at science, but their social structure, like the number of different body types they have and what the purpose of those different bodies are, is very much based around bee culture, because the bees have like, they have the queen, as you know, and they have the, you know, the drones and the workers and the blah blah, and some of those are engaged in reproduction and some of them are not. And so it's like, what happens when you take a primate species but you say this group is non-reproducing? They are asexual both in behavior and in physical body, like they have no reproductive organs. What does that mean for, like, the ones that we're seeing in the comic are the analog to the worker bees that are leaving the hive and going out and getting food and defending the hive and that kind of stuff. So we haven't encountered the other body types yet because we have not gone down into their underground layers. But but the humans are almost never going to interact with anyone else. So anyway, a lot of that is like, how does that change their social structure? But they also are primates, so grooming is very important. So part of it, they don't bond over sexual activity, they bond over grooming. And you know, if you take away this thing, like there's the principle of like conservation of energy, basically, where if you take away one organ, you replace it with a, I'm not explaining it particularly well, but for example, the ones that are not spending a lot of energy on maintaining a reproductive system have more energy to put into a defense system, so they're the ones that are covered in spikes, because it's like all of that energy is now going into, we are now big and strong and muscular and have, you know, razor sharp claws and all this kind of stuff, but we're not spending all of these calories maintaining and building this reproductive system, so other members of the species are not going to be as big, not going to be covered in spikes, but they have these other different things that they have going on. So all of that is kind of like scientific biological principles that are going into this thing, but not necessarily hard. It's not a hard science thing. So it's not like, well, let's figure out now how the DNA strands would have, you know, this part would have connected with this part and gone in. So I don't want to either burden myself or the reader with having it be too getting too lost in the weeds on that aspect of the world building, because it's still about the characters and their adventures rather than, here's this weird nerd thing that I read about. Here are these slugs that have chlorophyll. That's so cool. How can I work that into my sci-fi story?
But now we know.
Right.
So
Yeah.
we get all of the really interesting behind-the-scenes information.
Exactly.
Well, that's really, really great. And like I said, I love it, and I can't wait to read more of it. So
Thank you.
work on that, please.
So, the other aspect of inspiration, like I read a lot of science nerd stuff, but also reading a lot of nonfiction. So I would say the books that have been most influential to my writing of this particular story are 1491 and 1493 by Charles Mann, which is about the Americas pre and post European colonization. So what kinds of technology did First Nations people have that, you know, when the Europeans came in, it was like, we can't see any technology here. These people are primitives. Well, because they were looking with the wrong eyes. Of like, we're not seeing it because we're not seeing what we expect to see. So those books are both very interesting, both in terms of doing a lot of deep research into cultures that we have not gotten as much information about on a mainstream level, but also how those cultures changed over time and changed with interactions with disease and Europeans being like, let's murder you and take your stuff. So those were very influential just in terms of other ways that societies could be built without focusing on the European society. And also another book was The Ghost Map, which is about a cholera outbreak in London in, I think, 1850s maybe, which was very fascinating from the point of view of, again, kind of a pre-modern medicine. How do you deal with disease ripping through a crowded area when you don't have antibiotics? You don't even understand germ theory at that point.
Right.
So that was very interesting just in terms of thinking about kind of medical innovation in an environment where you don't have the same technology that we have now. So nonfiction stuff definitely is a lot of my inspiration for that story.
That's amazing.
Well, you've talked a little bit about your inspirations, so I was wondering if you had any favorite comics or characters or artists or authors besides your own work and the ones you've already mentioned.
So I answer this question differently every time I'm asked it, but today the ones that I'm thinking about the most probably are, because we've been talking a lot about things that actually influenced my own comics creation. Obviously, Alison Bechdel, she's come up twice or thrice in this discussion. She was the first queer comic I encountered and really got into and read a lot of, and not just her art style, but the way that she realized her characters, and kind of, I think, had a similar thing of like, they're running off and doing things, oh my god. And having that, I'm not really doing the type of long-running serial that she is or had done, but I think that was very influential to me in as far as like how to develop a character and how to kind of pare them down to their essentials, and even just in terms of technical aspects of like the first comic that I had, like the first time I really approached doing comics, I was like, what is her layout? Like how is she actually, how is she building her panels? How is she, constructing a transition from panel A to panel B to panel C? The very earliest politically incorrect strips are me absolutely 100% copying her layout because I didn't know what else to do. So her, also the Hernandez brothers, Love and Rockets, that was a very influential comic for me that I've read many times over. That I look at more for character design and rendering. Like Jaime Hernandez is obviously just kind of this phenomenal drawer of humans. So just sometimes studying like how does he draw a facial expression in a way that is simplified into comic form but also captures all the emotion that you're looking for. Like kind of, I think he's one of the best artists of doing that. And Beto Hernandez has like kind of the surrealist writing. It's like, how do you write something that isn't just like this necessarily a linear narrative or necessarily has to make sense in the traditional sense, but is nevertheless kind of this engaging story that seems to be like, I'm kind of making it up as I go, or am I? Maybe it was all planned out. And I would say obviously Charles Schultz and Peanuts and Calvin and Hobbes, Bill Watterson, phenomenal artist, and Crazy Cat with George Harriman, as far as Harriman is how you get Calvin and Hobbes in the first place. So if you go back and you look at especially later Calvin and Hobbes, where he's doing all these kind of like funky things with the layout, he's pulling a lot of that inspiration from Crazy Cat and George Harriman. And for your listeners who may not know, Crazy Cat is one of the first examples of a canonically non-binary character in comics. Crazy Cat was published from like 1916 to 1944. And to have a character that is aggressively neither male nor female and both male and female at the same time is this unprecedented thing. And speaking of getting a backlash, like Harriman always got a massive backlash. Like, is Crazy male or female? And if Crazy is male, then is he gay with this mouse? And that's immoral. But if it's female, then why are you calling Crazy Cat she? And there is a comic where finally this one character is like trying to figure out if Crazy is male or female. And it's one of the most beautiful comics in the whole series because Crazy is so much the protagonist in that, and the person who's being a nosy jerk and being like, tell me what you are, and Crazy is like, meh, kind of like completely evades in a way that is very like empowering rather than like like gazy, So so I love Crazy Cat just for like doing wild things with layouts for a newspaper strip, but also having this like queerness and transness represented in this newspaper comic that was like, how did you get away with doing that? I would say that kind of is I could throw out more names and we'll be here for another hour. It's like, and this person, and this person. But those are kind of the ones that I think kind of form a lot of my personal inspiration for who maybe want to do comics and who I looked at when I was trying to figure out the process of how to make a comic.
Thank you.
Yeah. So how can we better find and support more trans comics and artists and authors' work, including yours?
So the nicest thing is always to spend money on us. There aren't really any trans creators who are making bank out there, and any sale is always helpful to put money in the pocket of a trans person, especially given that many of us have weird hurdles to traditional employment. If your resume flags you as trans, you are 40% less likely to get a call back. So a lot of us go into weird professions because that's what we can do. Like, this is how we can actually earn money. A lot of us don't have access to kind of normal jobs. So I'd say first and foremost, like, putting money in our pockets helps us create and continue creating. And we're starting to see more mainstream publishers be like, maybe we should publish a trans. But it's like, you still find yourself in situations where it's like, oh, well, we already published a trans book, so we're set. We have one in our catalog.
Check that box.
We did a diversity. So still a lot of us are working in self-pub, working in web comics. So I have a Patreon. I have stuff for sale on Gumroad and on the Amazon.com. So that's one way, obviously, is give money to people who are making this stuff. A lot of us don't have money. Maybe we're also trans. We're like, I also don't have any money. If you also don't have any money, a thing you can do is to share their stuff with your friends. Because maybe you have friends who do have money, or who are like, my birthday's coming up and you should buy me this book. When they post something, retweet it, share it on Facebook, like it, reblog it, whatever. Or do an enthusiasm post of like, here are my 5 favorite trans cartoonists. Go check out all these people, because I can sit there and say, read my webcomic, and people think, okay, yeah, sure, whatever, everyone has a webcomic. But when your friend says, hey, I really like this thing, and I think you'll like it too, that recommendation has a lot more value. It has a lot more power to it, and people are much more likely to listen to their friends' recommendations than they are to rando on the internet saying, please read my webcomic. Those are the easiest ways to kind of like money, and social media sharing is good. Or, or just like another thing you can do is have it, like if you work for a library or are otherwise going to a library, make sure the library buys the books that these folks have to put on the shelf. I know there's different complications with getting things into a library system, but there are a lot of trans books that could be in the library, and they're just not because the librarians don't know about them. I would like to recommend a specific book.
Okay.
And not just because I'm in it, although that is part of why I recommend it. But there's a book called We're Still Here, which is an anthology put out by Stacked Deck Press. It is, I think, about 300 pages and a couple dozen different trans creators, many of whom are also queer and trans creators. But it's specifically focused on trans creators. So everyone who is published in there identifies as trans in some respect. And it is a great starting place for, I want to read some trans comics. Help me out. I don't even know who to read. And it's like, boom, here's a book with a couple dozen people to read. You will fall in love with some of the stories. Some of them may not speak to you, but you will find something in there that absolutely will be your most favorite comic now. And
That's awesome.
yeah, so I think I recommend it because, like I said, I have a piece in there, but also I think it's just a really well curated book. I think the selections are very good, and I read a lot of anthologies, and I think it's actually one of my favorite anthologies I've read.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great.
Yeah.
And I will second that thing about libraries. Even if you don't work in a library, there's always ways to get onto the website and say, hey, I think you need to buy this book. And even if only one person recommends it, that then puts it on somebody's radar.
Right.
I have definitely done that where I'm like, I think you should buy this.
Right. I've had people buy stuff for me at conventions specifically like to donate to a school library. Like my kid, the school librarian at my kid's school wants more queer stuff that's, age appropriate for 13 to 18 year olds. And so that they'll just buy stuff and give it to the library. Amazon is kind of an evil empire and whatnot, but it's also a really easy way for libraries to be able to purchase stuff with having a purchase history and the kinds of things that administrators like to see and they can offer a library discount too. So part of the reason my stuff is on there because you can do Create Space. It's not called Create Space anymore, but you can do. They actually have pretty good printing quality for comics. I've tried a couple other POD places, and I was not super happy with the quality, but it's this is actually looking pretty good, unfortunately.
Dang it.
And it gets that distribution where the libraries can buy it, so what are you going to do?
Yeah. Where else can we find your work?
So I have a website called studioendr.com, STUDIONDR. And that is kind of the home base for everything. I have a whole bunch of my comics online for people to read for free and to share for free. And that also has links to where to buy the books. I have a bunch of stuff on Gumroad. And I'll have links to anthologies I'm in, which I don't maintain stock on those, but I'll tell you where to get them. Valley of the Silk Sky has its own website, valleyofthesilksky.com. If you're a giant nerd, I post a lot of world building posts on there. If you're like, but you need to tell me more about this bee stuff because I have to learn more about this bee stuff. It lives in a separate stream from the comic. So if you're like, please don't. I just want to read the comic. Please don't bore me to death with this stuff. You can just read the comic and you'll be fine. But if you're like, I am desperate to find out all of the effort you went into to making up this bizarre fungus, why, I have done a post about that fungus. Here you go. So valleyofthesilksky.com it lives in its own space because it's kind of too big, and also studioender.com has stuff that is appropriate for adults and for. I try to keep it mostly 13 plus on there, but some stuff is probably going to shade more into adult stuff. The Valley of the Silk Sky website is definitively appropriate for 13 and up. So if you're like, what can I look at without my parents looking over my shoulder and being like, is that a boob? That you can look at it and maybe not get in trouble.
And you're on Twitter?
I'm on Twitter. I am Dylan NDR Edwards on Twitter.
And you make monsters.
I do. I make monsters called Seeping Creatures. They are all ages. They have their own website, feepingcreatures.com. I have my pins on my hat that you can't see, but you should look at them because enamel pins. The monsters are also non-binary because why on earth did I need a gender? I obviously have an outlet for I need to get out of gendered space for a while, and so there are certain things that I do. My own personal identity is I'm transmasculine. I use he/him pronouns, but I mostly identify as agender. So I'm like, you could get rid of all of it and I wouldn't care. So the monsters are also non-binary, and one of them has a little comic that's an all-ages comic where the monster uses they/them pronouns, and that's called The Ugly Little Beast, and it's a cute little story with puns and rats. And anyway, yeah, so I have too many websites and I do too many things.
but they're all amazing.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yeah,
we really
thank you.
appreciated talking to you, hearing more about your process and your inspirations, and we're excited to share more of your stuff out with the world.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So this has been another edition of File 741. I'm Leigh.
And I'm Beckah.
Thank you for listening, and please like us on Facebook or follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can tune in to all of our podcasts on iTunes, Podbean, YouTube, or at thefeminerdsfiles.net.
And you're like, pay attention.
Exactly.
Listen to the sounds that are coming out of my voice. Put your pencil down.